There comes a moment in every human life not marked by thunder or light, but by a silence so deafening you cannot unhear it. It is the hour when everything you believed was you begins to dissolve, not in chaos but in something more terrifying: truth. Most people speak of awakening as if it were a staircase toward bliss. But I must tell you, the true spiritual awakening does not elevate you, it undoes you. You will not rise until you descend. You will not find light until you walk through your own darkness. This journey does not ask for your beliefs. It demands your illusions. And so I ask you, have you ever felt the subtle tremor beneath your daily routine? That strange inner unrest that cannot be named? That is not boredom. It is the soul knocking. And once it begins, there is no return. This is not a path for the faint-hearted. It is for those brave enough to die while still breathing. Let me show you the 10 hidden stages of a real, spiritual awakening, not the ones taught in books, but the ones etched into the unconscious, waiting to break through the mask you wear. The self does not awaken gently. It erupts when the persona can no longer carry the weight of your unlived truth. There is a peculiar kind of silence that begins to haunt a man when the life he has built no longer mirrors the truth he carries within. Outwardly, all appears well. He may have a career, a family, possessions that declare his worth to the world. Yet inside, a quiet dissonance begins to hum. This is not the sound of failure, but of awakening. It is the first rupture of the mask, the moment when peace is no longer peace, but a polished lie. One must understand that the psyche is not satisfied with comfort alone. It seeks wholeness, and the persona, the image we craft for the world, was never designed to carry the soul. It was meant only to negotiate society. But in time, many come to confuse it with the self. When this happens, success becomes servitude. I once observed this in myself. During my early years, when I wore the robe of academic prestige and intellectual certainty, my lectures were well received, my theories gaining ground. Yet I sensed something inauthentic, a distance from my own depths. I was admired but unknown even to myself. This is the collapse of false peace. It is not dramatic. It begins subtly. A discomfort in familiar places, a restlessness in routines that once brought pleasure, a strange hollowness even amidst praise. One begins to speak but hears the falsity in one's own voice. And then comes the fatigue, not from labor, but from pretending. Once the mask begins to slip and the scaffolding of false peace crumbles, the soul long exiled begins to stir with a hunger that the world cannot satisfy. It is not a hunger for success, nor for pleasure, nor even for answers. It is the hunger for meaning. And this hunger does not scream, it whispers. It arrives not as ambition but as ache, a subtle sense that there must be more than this, more than survival, more than performance, more than the hollow repetition of inherited dreams. I remember vividly when this search overtook me, not in triumph, but in quiet rebellion. After breaking from the collective systems of belief that once defined my path, I would walk alone by the lake, not with purpose, but with a question: what is this life for truly? The books I had read no longer sufficed. The theories I once taught felt dry in my mouth. And so I began to seek, not as a scientist but as a soul. This is the sacred search. The mind, having lost its footing, begins to reach beyond the intellect. You may find yourself drawn to ancient texts, to symbols that appear in dreams, to traditions that once seemed foreign. You pick up a book by accident, only to discover it speaks precisely to what stirs within you. You hear a line of poetry that strikes your chest like lightning, not because it teaches you something new, but because it remembers something old. But beware, here lies a danger. The ego, having lost its identity, may attempt to possess the search itself. It begins to accumulate teachings, practices, rituals, not to transform but to control. One becomes a collector of wisdom, not a vessel for it. I have seen many wander this way, endlessly searching, yet never arriving, because they confuse spiritual consumption with spiritual communion. The true sacred search is not about becoming someone new, it is about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And when you begin to listen not just to teachings, but to the quiet voice beneath them, you will know the difference between knowledge and knowing. The soul hungers not for information but for resonance, and when you feel it, you will not need to chase. You will only need to follow. There is a moment in the sacred search when the fever of seeking softens. The mind, exhausted from reaching, grows still, and in that stillness uninvited, and yet unmistakably, welcome a flicker of something wholly different appears. It is not a thought nor a conclusion. It is a presence, a subtle warmth that rises not from the world outside, but from a depth within you that you had long forgotten. This is illumination, not the light of reason, but the quiet glow of the self emerging for the first time. I recall walking alone in the forest during my time in Bollingen, far removed from the noise of society, when a peculiar calm fell over me. The wind stirred the trees with a kind of reverence. The air held no answers, and yet it was full. Suddenly I no longer needed to know. I simply knew. And what I knew was not knowledge, it was being. That which I had searched for had never been far. It was buried beneath all my explanations. Illumination is rarely a thunderclap. It arrives as a symbol in a dream that refuses to leave you. As a conversation overheard, that feels like it was meant for your soul. As a silence that speaks louder than words, you begin to notice that reality itself becomes more porous symbols. Synchronicities, feelings of déjà vu. These are not hallucinations. They are the self trying to make contact through the veil of ordinary perception. But you must not mistake this light for a final arrival. It is not an ending, it is an invitation. And the ego, ever ambitious, may try to seize it, to wear it like another badge. Yet the self is not interested in display. It is interested in alignment. It will continue to speak in the language of dreams, of breath, of intuition, not to impress, but to guide. You may still feel confused. You may still question. But now, beneath the doubt, something unshakable has begun to take root. You have touched something real. And though it may flicker, it does not vanish. It leaves behind a trace, a subtle imprint that the soul will follow again and again. Once the self sends its first light, you are no longer entirely in the dark. As the self begins to cast its first light, the ego, long accustomed to control, awakens not to surrender, but to struggle. It senses its empire threatened by something it cannot command. This is the moment of resistance, and it does not come from outside forces but from within. A tightening begins, a quiet panic. You feel it in the mind's sudden urgency to explain away what cannot be explained, in the return to old routines with new discomfort, in the strange ache of knowing the truth and fearing it at the same time. I have seen this often, both in myself and in those who came to me seeking clarity. A man who has glimpsed his truth but clings to his role. A woman who has heard the soul's call yet runs back into a life built on pleasing others. They speak of confusion, but it is not confusion. It is resistance, the ego's last attempt to restore the old order. When I began to step away from the institutions that had shaped my early career, I too felt it. The fear of being wrong, the desire to return to comfort, to the known. Even if it meant betraying something deep and newly born, I would question my intuition, drown it in thought. But the more I resisted, the more fragmented I became. And it was then I realized resistance is not an enemy. It is a teacher. It shows you precisely where you are still holding on. You may feel as if you are regressing, as if the insights you once touched have disappeared. But that is the illusion of resistance. It clouds the light only to protect the structures that are now obsolete. The ego does not wish to die. It wishes to be needed. And so it fights, not because it is evil, but because it is afraid. But the soul has no need to argue. It only waits. Each time you choose authenticity over habit, silence over noise, presence over control, the ego loses a little more ground. And eventually, not through force but fatigue, it begins to let go. The weapons fall, not in defeat but in recognition. You no longer need to conquer yourself. You only need to stop defending what is no longer true. There comes a moment when the soul, now unburdened by pretense and no longer restrained by the ego's resistance, begins to pull you downward, not toward despair, but toward the truth buried in your own darkness. This descent is not a punishment. It is a sacred necessity, for what has been cast into shadow must one day be retrieved, or else it will rule you from beneath. This is the abyss, not a place, but a confrontation with all that has been exiled within you, and it will not be avoided. What you do not face within, you will meet without in projection, in pain, in repeated patterns you do not understand. I recall vividly my own descent, a time when I was no longer able to locate my identity in my work, my titles, or my intellect. The outer world continued, yet within me a chasm opened. Strange dreams haunted my nights, symbols I could not yet decipher. A serpent, a wounded child, a tower struck by lightning. They were not mere images. They were messages from the part of me I had long ignored. Rage, grief, envy, vulnerability all came forward, not as enemies, but as forgotten children seeking their place in my inner house. In this stage, the psyche reveals all that has been buried to preserve. Appearances, the fury beneath your politeness, the guilt beneath your perfectionism, the fear behind your ambition. It is not pleasant, but it is real, and until these elements are seen, they continue to animate your life from the dark. The shadow is not evil. It is simply unloved. To walk into the abyss is to say, I will no longer betray what is hidden. And yet within the very darkness you fear lies the gold of your authenticity. That which you thought would destroy you becomes the source of your deepest power. Your creativity, your truth, your full humanity, all of it waits here beneath the surface. And so you do not rise by escaping the abyss. You rise by walking through it with your eyes open. Only then can you say you have begun the real work of becoming whole. After the long descent into the shadow, something irreversible begins. You no longer return as the one who entered. The illusions you clung to for identity, security, and belonging begin to disintegrate, not with violence but with solemn grace. This is the death of the old self, not an abstract metaphor, but a lived inner crucifixion. You watch your former self unravel, thread by thread, while the world around you carries on unaware. This death is sacred, and yet it is rarely recognized as such. It does not announce itself. It often feels like numbness, disorientation, or a grief for something you cannot name. I remember sitting alone in Bolingen, staring into the still waters of the lake, feeling as though the man I had been was no longer present. The roles, the ambitions, the philosophical scaffolding I had built felt like husks. My hands still held books, yet the words rang hollow. My mouth still formed sentences, yet they no longer tasted like truth. This is the emptiness that precedes transformation. You do not feel awakened. You feel lost. And yet this void is not an error. It is a necessary silence. The psychic womb in which something unformed begins to stir. When the old self dies, the soul enters a liminal state. You are no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. This is where many turn back, confusing emptiness with failure, stillness with stagnation. But to rush through this space is to abort the deeper process. You must allow the silence to hollow you out. You must learn to wait. The ego grieves. It whispers that something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. What is dying is the false, the performative, the borrowed. What is emerging does not arrive through effort, but through surrender. The death of the old self is not an end, but a clearing. And though it feels like loss, it is actually love for the truth that can no longer be denied. Only from this sacred undoing can the authentic self begin to take root. You have not come this far to return to sleep. What you have touched through collapse, hunger, silence, resistance, shadow, and sacred death is not madness, but memory. The memory of who you truly are beneath every mask, every achievement, every borrowed belief. Awakening is not a single moment of light. It is 1,000 deaths and 1,000 quiet resurrections. It is not the soul's escape from the world, but its re-entry, now illuminated from within. You will still feel fear. You will still falter. But you will no longer be fooled by the surface of things. So I ask you now not to strive but to see, not to perform but to feel. Return to the silence. Walk toward the mirror, greet your shadow, and listen, truly listen, for the voice that speaks not from your mind, but from your depths. That voice is you. It always has been. Do not wait for the world to give you permission to become whole. Begin now. Strip away what no longer belongs. Honor what remains. And trust, though the path is narrow, the self walks with you. Now go. Not to become something more, but to remember what you were before you forgot.